think so too.
We probably had events here.
Yeah. Been a couple of events. Okay, here are the two. This is now on. Yep. Bare gi den til Katrine.
Hello.
Oh, it's on.
Hello. Yeah. Kan du gi den til Katrine?
Katrine. Ja, Katrine, den er på. Ja, ok. For jeg sitter jo heller enn mens jeg snakker. Skal vi stille alle spørsmål? Ja, hvem er det som holder på nå med den? Ja, det må vi se. er ledig her. Kan du kanskje sette en lenger inn, og så... Her er en ledig plass her, hvis det er noe litt sånn at folk... Er vi i gang i Zoom? Ja, skal vi bare begynne? Hello. Welcome to this seminar where we'll discuss how we can emerge stronger from today's multiple crises. It's nice to see all of you in the audience here in Oslo, and there's a couple of seats up here if you if you need a seat. And it's also nice to know that there's a lot of participants following us from around the world, since this seminar is a part of the Day Zero of the SDG Conference Bergen. Welcome to all of you. My name is Catherine Sund Henriksen, and I'm the Executive Director of Forum, which is the Norwegian Forum for Development and Environment. Forum is hosting this seminar in collaboration with UNDP Oslo Governance Center. We have a very distinguished panel with us today. But before I introduce them, I'd like to encourage the digital participants to post comments and questions in the chat. We'll include some of these together with comments and questions from the audience here in Oslo towards the end of the seminar. And now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who'll also participate in the panel afterwards. Mr. Hao-Liang Su has had an extensive career within the UN system and is now a UN Assistant Secretary General and the UNDP Director of Bureau for Policy and Program Support. We're very pleased that you're able to join us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Henrietta, for the warm welcome. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really privileged to be here to participate in this event, and very happy to for UNDP Oslo Governance Center to co-host this event, and as part of the Bergen SDG conference. And so, what I would say is that as we are talking about emerging from the multiple crises, I think it's really important and meaningful to partner with civil society organizations. And we are in a moment in history when development is in reverse. Right? We know that social cohesion is challenged. We know that trust between people and institutions is falling, right? And the civil society organizations like Forum, right, with 15 member organizations, really represent the strongest, counterforce, to this reversal. And we in the United Nations Development System, right, we are, the instruments of our member states, right, to serve, we will serve our member states and ultimately to serve our people. But we cannot do that job, well without working closely with civil society. So thank you, Forum, right, and also Catherine, right, for this, partnership here in Norway, and also with many of your member organizations outside Norway. Let me start by also saying that while we're indeed, in the midst of multiple crises, and I'm very glad that this session's focus, is not just on the green picture that before us, but also challenging us to come up with the solutions that will help us emerge stronger, better, and wiser. So we're indeed facing uncertain times, and uncertainty complex, as UNDP's 2022 Global Human Development Report calls it. Right? And it has resulted in human development regressions for the first time over the last 32 years. Right? And due to war, due to global political tensions, due to the soaring cost of living, right? And also due to climate, debt crisis, and many other issues we're dealing with today. And this year is the midpoint of the Agenda 2030 implementation. Right? So we have less than 7 years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. and we know that we're far from achieving many of them. Right? However, right, out of this adversity, we have faced, through COVID, for example, right? We also have learned a lot, right? And there are some, positive messages, lessons that we learned from this, dealing with this crisis. For example, digital solutions. Right? In the case of UNDP, in early 2020, within 7 days, we migrated the entire organization from physical presence to digital working. Right? So we've learned, how to, use digital technology, right, to overcome these challenges and to address really the realities, right, even when we're isolated, right, and we cannot, work physically, but we can work online effectively. So we learned a lot, how technology, digital solutions can help. Also, through this adversity, community groups have come together quickly to respond to the crisis, and at the local level. And social movements emerged worldwide, demanding justice, right, and an end to endemic corruption, for example. Right? So the work didn't stop because of this crisis. And let me also give some other examples, right, where positive, bright spots, have been observed, right. For example, going beyond business as usual to address the existential threat of climate change is one area that progress has been made. Last year, for example, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the right to a healthy and sustainable environment. So this is a milestone event. Right? It is a landmark moment to reduce environmental injustice and provide a framework to protect and promote the environment as well as the rights of indigenous people, environmental human rights defenders, and others. Right? So this is really an important achievement. Right? Coupled with the COP15 on biodiversity, global framework. Right? So we have now an agreement, right, to spur action to address biodiversity loss, restore ecosystems, and protect indigenous rights. Right? Because the global framework on biodiversity, right, is the equivalent of Paris Agreement. It's that important, right? So we have this positive development. Right? So UNDP, we work across the board, right, at grassroots levels included. Right? We work very closely with civil society organizations to drive local action, right, to achieve results. So this is one bright spot. And the other one I would mention is that, right, we see that responsive, accountable, and inclusive governance systems, right, is critical to address sustainable development. Right? And confronted with a multitude of interconnected and complex crises, governance systems are under stress. Right? They're under enormous stress. At the same time, a report launched by our Oslo Governance Center last year, right, and says very clearly that the only way out of this crisis is by investing in inclusive, accountable, and future-oriented governance systems and processes. Right? There's strong evidence, right? And I personally have really done a lot of research with my colleagues. And we're convinced that the quality of governance determines the outcome of development efforts. Right? So despite all these global pressures on governance systems and so forth, we're seeing pockets of inspiration, right? Experimentation and innovation in governance, right? From designing new models of participation, exploring and alternative avenues of decision making, right? And also mounting of civic engagement, and activism to define pathways for development, that are grounded in local realities, right? In Tunisia, for example, adopting an anti-corruption approach to the health sector has both lowered medical costs and increased patient satisfaction in selected public hospitals, for example. Right? So governance, right? There's a progress, a movement in this area. And I can give examples in Panama, in Somalia, and many other places. Right? And the third area, I think is, again, a positive development we have seen, right? Is that we see that the digital technology, right, holds enormous potential to accelerate development. Right? And we have been using that ourselves, but also we see this in many other areas. This requires, in a way, overcoming the digital gap for the 2.7 billion people in the world that still do not have access, right, to digital means. Right? And it means that preventing the spread of misinformation and disinformation, right, this has become so important, right, when it comes to digital solutions. Otherwise, they would destabilize our communities, right, and creating situation of conflicts. But using technology, digitalization, also calls for digitalizing our governance systems that can bring enormous benefits and services, right, closer to people, and rebuild confidence in governance systems. Again, I can give many examples, but just one example I would cite, for example, is in Bangladesh. Right? We worked with the Bangladesh government over the last 15 years to develop digital solutions for service delivery. Right? From one pilot project for one-stop shop, service provision, to now a government-wide efforts to innovate. Right? Everything that the services are provided by the government online, now there are hundreds of them provided online through a network of service stations across the countries, right? And in a cloud-based system, right? All with the interest of people in mind, right? Over the last few years now, for example, since the system is in place, 4.09 billion services has been provided digitally across the country through web portal, through smartphones, and through regular telephones, right? Because you don't want to create a disparity, right? Because people have different levels of technology and access. As you want to make sure anyone can have access to this system for service delivery, right? And they have saved 7.43 billion visits to government offices. So you can obtain services online. And you saved 12.23 billion days that you would have spent to go to government offices, right, to obtain these services. And you saved people, right, saved $16.62 billion of travel cost, and through transparency for service delivery, right? So digitalization holds enormous potential for solutions, and we're working now across 40 countries on these kind of solutions, right? So the point is we really must leverage digital systems, right, to deliver for people, right, and improving access, while protecting their rights, right? So finally, let me end with this thought, right? We're at a critical time, right? And there are many who say that the UN is not fit for purpose in this world of poly crisis, right? And there are many this group of people, right, and colleagues of ours sometimes have a lot of evidence to substantiate that argument, right? I would really argue for the opposite, right? I think the UN, is perhaps the most significant example of larger scale and collective action, right, that is effective in many areas, right? And without the UN development system, right, we would not have delivered the kind of support that we delivered across countries, right? In my discussion with MFA officials, with NORAD, Director General, right, I gave some examples of the scale of work we do and the impact we achieve. Right? Before COP27, for example, we worked with 120 countries, 85% of developing countries, to renew their nationally determined contributions. Right? So that now we are working with them to turn pledges into actions across board. Right? We're working with more than 80 countries on the financing strategies, right, to align public, private, domestic, and international resources together towards SDGs, towards their national development goals. Right? So it is the UN development system at work. Right? And I won't even mention peacekeeping and the humanitarian actions of the UN that are contributing to address the crisis. Right? So to work together to make UN effective, it requires us to building partnerships, right? And it also requires investments, right? Like the strong cooperation we have with Norway, right? Norway is one of the few donors, right, that have kept the goal of 1% of GNI for ODA, right? And against the trend of reducing ODA, right, Norway has been the strongest supporter of UN development system, including for UNDP, right? So we need, to work together to continue this investment, right? That allows UN to be a strategic partner of Norway and other, countries, partner countries in development. And I think, only, by working together, can we emerge, stronger, right, and more effective out of this poly crisis, and ultimately to help achieve the sustainable development goals by 2030. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Many interesting points that we will follow up on in the discussion. And there seemed to have been a problem with the sound in Zoom at the beginning, so I would just like to now welcome again the participants that are participating through Zoom, and also to encourage you to post questions and comments in the chat, and we will include some of those later on. We'll now move on to Bård Vegar Solhjell, who is the director of NORAD, the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, a professional body under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has previously... I just have a short introduction.
Sure.
He has previously been Minister of the Environment and Minister of Education in Norway, as well as the director of WWF Norway. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Great to be here. Thanks for Forum for hosting, and also thanks to Harling for explaining so well the importance of the UN as a whole, and the UNDP, one of the most important partners of NORAD and Norway in creating long-term development globally. So all is not bad, and let me also start by to kind of contextualizing where we are, because we have behind us 2 generations or more of immense human progress. And I think we have to start by acknowledging that. So if we go back to when Norwegian Development Assistance started in 1950, more than 6 out of 10 people globally were extremely poor. So most people were simply poor. If we go to today, that's it's less than 10% globally that is extremely poor. We once saw education and electricity as luxury goods. Now it's widespread. And just looking at the last few decades, every year since the turn of the century, there's been a reduction of the percentage of extremely poor globally. And maybe most impressive, child mortality has been more than halved since the turn of the century. So it's in that light we need to understand that we are now facing a very different situation. Maybe the first real setback in a generation or so, which is probably long term. So extreme poverty and many of the social and economic factors, associated with it, from gender equality to education to other things, has now been increasing. The problems are increasing globally at scale. It started before COVID because COVID was the big turning point, and Russia's brutal attack on Ukraine has strengthened that negative direction. But we are also at the same time seeing a backslide in democracy and political rights. Of course, there are many tendencies, but the global average or direction has been going in the wrong way for years now. And that's also extremely worrying because, like Howland said, governance is so closely connected to development outcomes. And then, of course, third and behind all this is what's the great development destroyer in the decades to come, the climate and nature crisis, which we are already seeing the consequences of. And of course, the definition of injustice is, of course, that some countries or some parts of the world created the problems. And we will all face the consequences, but those with hardly any emissions or any responsibility will face the largest consequences, have the least resources to deal with it. For instance, many of the sub-Saharan African countries. So that's the situation, and in this situation, development spending is also under pressure. Partly development spending is under pressure from the many crises, from humanitarian spending, which is needed. Partly it's under pressure from financing really important global public goods, and partly it's under pressure from the domestic situation in many developing countries, which, of course, where there's a pressure to cut spending or to spend money otherwise. So what do we do in this situation? Well, let me give you just 4 brief points towards the end, and I just warn you, all of them are much easier to say than to do. So I'm just speaking, they're all really, really hard. So first, we have to finance according to the needs. So when we now that empirically the needs are bigger, we actually have to finance more global development. And I mean that ODA, I mean from middle-income countries, I mean from the private sector, I mean from the different sources that we have to finance development in its broadest sense. So we have to finance according to the needs. That's the first. Second, we have to work together to end short-termism and establish a more long-term thinking and what we do when we finance or when we do policy. And I think that's extremely important. We know that long-term development, long-term investments in governance, in institutions and so on, work when it's done well. But there's we are all seeing now or faced with the immediate issues, and they're drawing our attention and capital, and we have to try to re-establish our ability to deal with situations in long-term ways. So to make sure that when we're dealing with food security crisis, we're we're not just repairing it, we're investing in food security in the long term, and so on. Third, and also extremely important, to try to re-establish our ability to talk and solve problems globally better than we have been able to do. And Howling made a really good example, the Nature Agreement, the Montreal Agreement just before Christmas. One example that the world can actually still come together, agree in a really difficult and important issue, and create a global agreement. A wise man who's, by the way, also now Prime Minister of Norway has once written that eternal talk is not so bad if eternal conflict is the alternative. And I think that's quite well said. Talking, trying to agree is extremely important for solving global problems. And then, of course, fourth, working with the body of institutions that we do have that underpin global development today, and I'm talking about the United Nations, its many agencies, and other institutions, the banks and so on. Now, more than for a long time, we really need those institutions. And that does not mean not to criticize them. You always criticize someone you trust and is a close friend, but you also understand how important they are, fund them and work with them. So that's my really easy recipe. Thanks again for being here. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite all the 4 panelists to join us here. Just come up. And the 2 that haven't had the chance to give an introduction will be given the chance to speak first. We have over there Heidi Finskas, who is the Vice President of Corporate Responsibility at KLP, Norway's largest pension company. She has a long experience working with responsible investments. And then there's Henriette Westrin, who is the Secretary General of the Norwegian People's Aid. In addition to representing civil society here, she has experience working with environmental and financial issues as a State Secretary in different ministries. So, yes, I think we've embarked on a big task here today, because there are so many big questions, and already in these introductions we've heard so many different issues that need to be addressed. But I thought we should start with talking a bit about the finance issue and all the needs that need funding. And there's a lack of funding. We need money for development finance, climate finance, and also to address the loss of biodiversity. And there is a lot of money in the world, but does it go to the right places? And is it, well, the question is for you, Heidi, with responsible investments. You've been working with this for many years, so I'm wondering, how is your sector contributing? Are you helping to solve the different crises?
At least we're trying as much as we can. No, I do think that the finance has a key role to play in that. It actually goes back to what you said, Rebecca, about long-termism. Because what finance institutions, especially like pension funds, institutional investors like KLP, are indeed very long-term. And what we see is that these challenges that you've been describing now, they actually pose a financial risk to us, not only to us, to the global economies and the financial markets. So that gives the finance industry an interest to get engaged in these issues. And so we have. And I think that has helped to put the issues on the agenda and show that this is not only a national concern, this is not only a concern for specific NGOs or specific or labor organizations, depending on what issues you're saying. Because as investors, we have a global spectrum. And we have a financial interest to say this is actually an economic interest as well, and in that way we can mobilize even more attention, even more forces to it. But you asked in the beginning, are there enough money? No, of course there's not, because as of today the capital is not going to where the needs is the greatest, and you also pointed out that because as of today the capital is flowing to where the returns are and where the level of risk is most appropriate for institutional investors. And we can actually see that the trend is going in the opposite direction. It's even less private capital going towards the least developed countries where we know that the investment needs are the greatest. So and that is completely a different question about how can we address that. Well, it's about de-risking in many ways. So there is something for us both in the finance industry as well as in governments as well.
So do you think there is hope that you can do better?
I think there is absolutely. There is, for instance, what we've been doing in KLP, we have invested in developing countries to address the sustainable development goals and these investment needs. And we've found partners to do that. And so what we're trying to do is to establish those partnerships, establish those structures that makes it possible for institutional investors like us to invest there and show that this is possible and that we're getting good returns, for instance. And it was also you talked about collaboration and how important that is. So now we're in a point in time where there is an increased interest in collaboration between different actors. So we're collaborations across borders, public and private, industrial actors and finance institutions. So there is definitely a great interest there. But again, we need the international level playing field. Vega, you talked about how important it is that we have these arenas where we're talking about solving the issues, because that is so important to us as finance industry as well, that we have the policies in place that creates the frameworks, that creates the, gives the investment opportunities to us as well.
And now over to you, Henriette, because the issue of financing, of course, includes also aid, ODA, official development assistance, and there are so many needs, but it's also quite complicated, and it was mentioned here previously as well. But you have the long-term development aid and the humanitarian aid, and this nexus, and maybe the triple nexus if you include peace, and you want to make it even more complicated, and it's just not possible to meet all the needs. But how should this money be prioritized when deciding where it should go, and how to make sure it's sufficient? and I have to say, we only have big questions here today. We don't have any small questions.
And here's the answer. Thank you for that challenge. But let me start by answering the question you got, saying, is there hope? And I'll say that companies like KLP, they are examples that gives hope, because we need those who really try to understand the broader consequences from their investments. And I think that's also something that's needed by states, because when we are sitting in a situation with multiple crises, it's so easy that we're looking at one problem and seeking investments towards that problem, but we doesn't actually always try to understand what consequences will the investment have towards other crises. And I want to say thank you to Norad, who recently launched a report about climate and inequality as a typical example on how you have to see those problems together. Because unfortunately, too long we have worked hard raising money, facing the climate crisis, but we haven't really understood what consequences those kind of investments will have on inequality. And you know that in many countries, the needs for renewable energy is really, really high. But on the other hand, you have examples that we are investing in building renewable energy in a way that actually makes inequality increasing in the same countries. Because the money goes to private companies, there might even be corruption, and people living in areas are forced to flee. And they don't. In Honduras, we have examples where people living in an area were forced away. They still didn't get access to electricity. The only thing that happened was that they saw the cables, the grid, going over their heads out to a multinational company. And everyone's saying, oh, that's a good example of how investments could have been. And the people who protested, they were even killed during protests, which again connects to the situation for democracy and supporting civil society. So I think it's really, really important that also when it comes to finance, we have to make sure to look closer into which problems are we actually seeking to solve. And that's when it goes both to private and public financing. And we also have to think about asking who are the ones who knows where the needs are the most. And then it comes to supporting civil society, as was mentioned by UNDP. We have to listen to those who are living in the crisis, and we have to listen to the local organizations, and not just the governments, because we have so much examples of bad governance in the same countries. So how to make sure that we actually understand the consequences of the investments, and how to make sure that we are listening to those who are living in the middle of the crisis. I think that's extremely important when it comes to financing, because too often we have worked, and also everyone is working for their own case, and we say we need more funding for climate, and we need more funding towards inequality, and we don't always manage to understand how to see those crises together.
What you're telling is a perfect illustration of the risks, how we as investors view the ESG risks, especially when it comes to investing in low-income countries, and how important it is with democracy and sound frameworks and building institutions in that host country. So had we overcome some of those issues, a lot more capital would flow to those markets.
And I would also like to fill in that what we hear from civil society working in the middle of the crisis is that they always aiming for something better than what was the situation before the crisis started. They are, when you go to Ukraine today, civil society, they are focusing on building back better. They don't want to come back to where they were before the Russian invasion. They are thinking that what we are doing today can't just meet the humanitarian needs we are in the middle of now. We should also think about how can we support those people who will be there after the crisis, when it comes to corruption, when it comes to democracy, when it comes to inequality. So managing to combine the long time and the short term history, I think that's also important. And I think it's very important what Borvega says, that we should remember that it takes time. And it's too easy to jump from one crisis to another. Sometimes I'm thinking about the Marshall Plan after the Second World War and how long it took. As long as until late 70s, children from Germany were sent to Norway to be fed because they were still starving after the Second World War. And we are thinking, oh, Syria's going on for 12 years. Now we are looking towards some other crisis, and we don't get finance to Yemen and to South Sudan. And we have to understand that in Afghanistan, when NATO had been there for 20 years, that's not a long time. That's short time when you are struggling to change crisis. So also being patient, I think that's important.
Within the UN as well, there's a lot of focus on building back better, isn't there? It's an important discussion. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think the concept of building back better is critical. I think the key question here is, what you have learned from the previous, development stages or crises, and the question of really looking at the long-term sustainability of our development trajectory is critical. There's one example in a book written by a scholar from the University of Chicago about the development experience of China, right? That in one city, she gave an example of one city, that China experienced a phenomenal growth over the last 40 years. So that city prospered, right, through a pursuit of industrial strategy. The city developed, income increased, infrastructure improved, standard of living improved. But at the same time, the damage to environment was also tremendous. So they discovered that cleaning up that damage is costing more than what they have earned over the last 40 years. So it just shows that when you pursue development, you really have to think holistically. Right? So these are the lessons that we have learned, right? And building back better certainly is to avoid the problems of the past, so that when we rebuild and we can create a better situation that is also nature positive, right? And climate, as sort of a positive, and I think that's really, one of these lessons. There's so many examples of this.
And how are you doing this, for instance, in NORAD with the looking at all the crises at the same time within the development aid sector? How is it possible?
It's possible to look at them at the same time, yes, but it's really, really hard to work coherently with them at the same time. I think everyone who's trying knows how difficult that is, and Henriette gave good examples of that. But where the framework, where the world has to deal with this is the Sustainable Development Goals. There are many strengths and also some weaknesses, but a main strength is, of course, that we have agreed common framework, and a lot of people know about it and so on. Maybe to pick up a little bit on at least our thinking now about it and funding is that, so we produced another report, and actually then the one Henriette mentioned before the NORAD conference, showing that we're really far off track now to reaching the SDGs. This was not a surprise to anyone, of course, who follows, international affairs, but still. So they are way underfinanced, and we can, for instance, the goal number 1, eradicating poverty, can risk being at about the same level as today, the number of extremely poor globally. If you look at the numbers, the number of money we would need to finance it, is of course a theoretical number, with a lot of premises, but if you look at that, it looks big. If you compare that number with the total global private equity, the capital stock of the world, it's around 0.5% of that, right? So compared to what the existing capital, it's almost nothing. But compared to development assistance, it looks enormous. That's of course why companies like KLP and other private investments comes into the picture. One of the major solutional changes we need to, as a society, need to get done, is of course that a little more, not a lot, a little more of global investments like FDI and so on needs to go to where it's most needed. The problem is just that's also where it's most risky, like you are discussing. And dealing with those risks, the political risks, the financial risks, the fact that capital is more expensive when you're financing a project there. Maybe also the perceived risk, I would say, which is something that I seem, I don't think it's a big issue maybe in KLP. I mean, many other companies it could be. That's an extremely important issue. How can development agencies do more? But how can the private sector do more without just getting support? Just because there's a lot of potential, and with building competence and dealing with the risks, many have shown that they can.
Yeah. If I can add a couple of points here on this question of financing and private sector capital. I think one thing is to align all investments towards SDGs. Right? So I think this is an effort we're trying to make. We did a lot of studies of development financing in developing countries, depending on the level of development. In many countries, which was a bit high level of development, let's say 30% of development financing comes from public sector, and 70% of development financing comes from private sources. Right? But for countries with lower level of development, you see the reverse, right? So the governments, are able to provide or needed to provide 70% of development financing, and 30% comes from private sector. Why? Because the private sector doesn't have an interest to invest in this place where it is considered more risky, right? So in whichever case, the key is that you want all financing, especially more and more countries are developed in middle-income country now. So public financing is becoming smaller and smaller proportion of development financing. So you want private capital to also align to SDGs. To achieve that alignment, we have worked with the private sector, with the finance industry, to have developed SDG standards for private equity, for enterprises, and for public bonds. So if you take these standards and apply them through your business process, then we can say that you can be certified that your investment is aligned to SDGs. Right? So this is the kind of efforts we're making to align private capital to SDGs. Now there are some other things that private sector can do. When it comes to borrowing money, right, private sector investment in a country, the rating agencies play a critical role, right, that we don't often talk about, because the cost of borrowing depends a lot on the rating system, right? Whether you're AA rating or B or whatever, right? The rating system, okay? Now we have done studies that shows that if you account, for the risks properly, and if the ratings for developing countries is improving by 0.5 percentage points, the lower the cost of borrowing means about $200 billion of additional financing for developing countries, for example. So there are now many areas, streams of work that are trying to free up more capital and align capital to to SDGs. So these are some examples.
Yes, ultimately we have to work towards the direction where we're aligning all investments with the SDGs, and I think that is happening step by step. And as you all probably know, we have a massive regulation in the finance sector now when it comes to sustainability. EU is in the driving force here, and I really applaud that. I think that has been such an important contribution to really get not only the few suspects or a few investors, but really the whole industry is now looking into sustainability risks as a result. But on the other hand, we also must be very careful that movement when it comes to sustainability regulation in the EU is not stopping capital from flowing towards more risky areas, because it could actually contribute to that as well, because the SDG awareness and the regulatory requirements, the transparency requirements, it raises the bar. And that could actually make some investors even more afraid of going into these risky markets. So we have to balance those two aspects and make sure that it's not stopping capital flows from that reason.
Yeah, and it was kind of the same dilemma I wanted to point towards as well, because we need to raise more private capital. But on the other hand, we also have to make the investors responsible for the consequences of the investments. I think it's very important that we have those international guidelines on responsible businesses, but we do also see that they are definitely not always followed. And sometimes it's like when civil society criticizes businesses for breaking those regulations, they are like, oh, but we are there at least. Shouldn't you just say that it's good that you are in these countries instead of always criticizing us? But we need to continue putting on demands also and understand the consequences of the investments as well. And that's something that also I think private investments have to understand. And I think that, again, we need to listen to those living in the countries where the investments are done, how to make better consultancies, how to understand the consequences of the investments. And at least we have to make our own authorities responsible for following the same guidelines. And they are not even always strict enough by themselves. In NPA, we are making reports about ties to the Palestinian occupation. And we have lots of examples where also Norway do invest in companies which are breaking humanitarian law. And then it's not easy to make them put demands on private investments when they're not loyal to the same regulations by themselves. So I think that's because we do need more private investments, but that also means that we have to continue discussing how to make sure that the investments helps reaching our goals, because it's not like growth is a success by itself, and investments is a success by itself if the growth only goes to making the extremely rich even richer, and you don't look at the consequences for the labor markets and labor rights and so on.
Thank you. We're gonna move on from this finance issues, but Vegard, you can have the last word. But also, if you could include something about the issue of tax.
Yeah, I was actually going to move on, but
yeah,
and also say a few things. But because private investments are really important part of the solution, but there are also quite a few things that will not be financed by the private sector, and and typically I'm thinking about public services, education, healthcare, and so on, which we know from Norway it's at the backbone of why we have growth and are able to function well as a society. And while private investments will be an important part of the solution for, whether it be water services or electrification or things like that, will probably not be that important for building schools or providing support to health, sexual right and SRHR, sexual right and reproductive health and rights, basic health systems in countries and so on. And what we've seen after COVID was that financing were drawn from these issues to financing COVID needs and vaccinations, which is really important. But now we've seen again a rise, for instance, in malaria, tuberculosis, and so on. And take one example, and that is sexual and reproductive health and rights. That's actually, we know that that's one of the most cost-efficient interventions we can do in development assistance. So it's an extremely efficient way of spending our money, because not only is it good benefits for sexual education or family planning and so on, it has all these big societal positive consequences. And it will mainly have to be financed by governments themselves. And in developing countries, governments now are strained financially, many of them high debt, or by development assistance. So I worry now that the crisis focus will draw funding from these extremely important and effective long-term interventions that we believe are so important.
Thank you.
It's probably where tax also comes into the picture.
And tax is also an important issue here, but I think I'll just say that Forum, together with Norwegian Church Aid, is hosting another seminar later today, where we will look into how to create an alliance for a UN tax convention. So I hope to see many of you there, and then the issue of tax will be discussed in depth. And also related to finances, the debt crisis will be addressed by someone here in the audience, I think. So we've covered some parts, but I thought we should go over to also talking about, because it's not all about the money, it's mostly about the people. That's the most important thing. And there's a lot of focus on the polarization in the world right now, both within countries and between countries. But I thought we should start out with something a little bit more positive. Henriette, if you could say a little bit about the role of the grassroots movements, and how are people mobilizing now, and what difference can this make?
Yes, I would love to talk about that. And you were talking about that you saw these kind of pockets of inspiration when it came to governance. And in NPA, where we are working with grassroots movements, I see those pockets of inspiration every day in many countries during crisis, because we really can see how people organize and mobilize and make changes during crisis in their own situation. And I think that the regime in Myanmar, after the coup, they were really, really surprised of how strong the civil society managed to mobilize and still are there fighting against the new regime. And they will not surrender. And they managed to work towards hard conflicts they had in between each other before the coup. And now they have turned together facing those people. And you can see what happened in Sudan, where you had lots of civil society organizations together supporting a revolution. And now, when they are standing on a tipping point, in a way, in Sudan to see what's happening. Still, you see the same. They are uniting, they are standing together, and they manage from different backgrounds to have common demands on the government. And you could look at Colombia. I mean, in Colombia, you have had organizations for indigenous people, for farmers, for Afro-Americans. They have been the same organizations who's been there since the Civil War, and they took part in the peace process. And they were then when the peace process didn't succeed. And now again, they're part of the new peace process. And now we have a vice president in Colombia who was one of the representatives of the strong civil society movements that you have had for almost 20 years. Now has changed, and you could go to Bolivia. There are so many examples of civil society actually standing there and representing people. And that's also what's making hope, because when people do unite and they can see that they can make changes, even in situations where it's hard to understand that there is hope. But on the other hand, since they do manage to make change, there's also so many governments who use all the tools they have to depress the civil society. And that's also where authoritarian regimes learn from each other and being inspired from each other. It's not just civil society doing so. So that's also extremely important that we are there supporting them, helping them. But I think in every crisis you have local actors who can make a change, and they do so. But then you also have to go back to what's about financing, because they very seldom see any of the investments coming to their society, and they see money going somewhere else. And I'm quite convinced that with just a little bit more of the money spent on aid supporting those groups, you could get much more change than what we see today.
This is a very important point. And I think because what we see in the world now, that there are so many social movements that are doing so many good things, but is there enough support from the international community? No, the answer is no. No, and I was at the seminar last week on Myanmar, and the question was, how can Norway support the democracy movement in Myanmar? And there was a young activist who said, well, you know what to do because you're doing it with Ukraine. And of course, everyone thinks it's a very good thing to support Ukraine, so that's not the issue. But how is it to be within your own country or as a diaspora in Norway, and you see how the Western countries are mobilizing for Ukraine, but no one or very few are mobilizing for the situation in your country? Yeah.
But I would like to say that no, we do not do that in Ukraine, because we do not mainly support the civil society organizations. We were in Ukraine 2 weeks ago visiting women's organizations who has been the frontline humanitarian actors now for a long time, because they were there. And what they see is lots of different international organizations now actually going in competing with them, who's been on the ground all from the time. And they are really worried about what's happening. So I don't think that we should say we do the right thing in Ukraine. In Ukraine, they had a strong civil society. They have been on the ground. They are there. But now they are often seeing that we are pushing them away, instead giving the money to international organizations. So we should definitely not always learn from what we're doing in Ukraine. But yes, there should definitely be more support towards organizations. And then, to make it even more difficult, it comes with sanctions. How to finance civil society organizations in Myanmar in a safe way, when going around those international sanctions, that also makes it more difficult.
Yes.
On this point, I think the two things. One is that we have learned very clearly that in order to achieve effective development outcomes, you need all sections of society to be involved. Right? So working with governments alone is not sufficient. It's clear. Right? So private sector, civil society organizations, academic organizations, youth movements, right? They all needed to be part of the decision-making process. And also, in UNDP now, right, UNDP, we're now trying to shift from, individual projects, right, to strategically designed portfolios to deal with complex problems. Right? Now, this methodology requires us to work with all stakeholders collectively. Otherwise, then you will not be able to address these complex issues strategically. Right? To find a solution, nothing can be more effective in a way to actually work with the intended beneficiaries or problems, right, that people experience directly. Right? So I think that this is the one thing that we've learned. So we have a very clear shift now, systematically to include all sectors of society in developing the policy, debate, and the decision making. This is one. Right? I can give examples of our programs. No. On the other hand, I also want to say that we cannot underestimate the importance of governments, and politicians, and the elites, right, in determining the outcomes of development efforts. There's a book not long ago published by a professor of Oxford University, I think the former chief economist of the FID, and his name is Stephen Durkheim. Right, right? He wrote a book about gambling on development. His central, I think, point, as I read it, is that the development outcomes, happen. Okay, very often is because that the elite of the country has decided that it is better off for everyone to be better off, right? So that they will also be in a position to continue their privileged position in a way, right? And the aid and the outside, support, the role is very limited, right? So I think the point is the political commitment is important. The quality of governance is important. Then supported by whole of society approach, then I think can we really achieve the outcome we hope, right? So I think everything really has to work together. Thank you.
There are so many issues that we should have addressed that I have on my cards, but I think because we're going to have room for some interventions from the audience as well. I would just like to finish off with talking a little bit about how do we now, because this is quite depressing times. But a positive approach to this is if all these crises are interlinked, then if we find solutions to one of them, then maybe we're also there'll be some co-benefits for others. For instance, climate is a big one that affects poverty and many other topics. But the problem is if people are becoming, if there's a feeling of apathy, what do we do with this? How do we build solidarity and generate motivation for action instead of apathy in the world now? But Vegard, you're an optimist, so that's why we invited you.
Oh, that's good. Then I actually know there's one reason why I'm being here. No, I sometimes call myself an empirical optimist. I disagree with people who kind of tend to think that things are largely not going so well, or that's hoping is naive or things like. I mean, if you go back, it's realistic to expect progress. In modern times, since the Industrial Revolution, the world has largely been able to produce progress. Not linear progress, but immense progress. And secondly, I mean, if you look at the worst crisis we have behind us in a century or so, humanity sometimes shows itself at its best to deal with them when we acknowledge the crisis. The problem is often that it has to be so deep and total before we are able to get our act together. But I mean, the way we've been dealing after wars or pandemics or natural disasters, we are often at our best. So I have a strong belief, and not only a hope, I would say it's a belief that we are able to fight back and develop, even though there are lots of problems and difficult and conflicting interests and so on. So, to answer your question, I think hope is realistic.
That's good to know. Now we'll move on to some questions and comments from the audience. And first we have Hector Uloa, who's the president of SAI, the Norwegian Students and Academics International Assistance Fund.
Thank you, and thanks for such a wonderful conversation. Am I supposed to stand? So yes.
You can stand, and the camera is there.
Yes. We have been talking about multiple crises. In our organization, we work mainly with education, so I'll talk about education also, because we believe it's a very cross-cutting issue and a guarantor of other human rights and other rights that the Sustainable Development Goals target. And there has been some mentions on democratic backlash. Also, we see that this leads to increased polarization in societies. And an impact on the education sector is also increased persecution to those that are, for example, researching on these topics that we need solutions for, and more attacks on the education sector. So I just wanted to make very quickly, share one assumption, a fact that we have seen, and then ask you a question related to that. And the first one is that when we see this increased polarization, it would seem that now we're moving to less international cooperation when it comes to education, less mobility, less research collaboration, and we believe that it is essential for us to solve global problems to then also strengthen these global issues and get knowledge from places like the Global South or other places where usually you wouldn't go there, or historically we haven't asked these places or collected information and knowledge from there. So that's the first assumption. We need more collaboration in a time where this is decreasing. And the other thing is something that you mentioned, Vegard, on national budgets and the importance of funding education, because we know that education is mainly coming from national budget at this time, and in a time of multiple crises, we see that education is clearly not a priority for these national budgets because you need to attend other issues that are considered more urgent. So with these competing budgets and education still being considered an expense and not a long-term investment like it has been mentioned here so many times, we see that even though the United Nations had, for example, the Transforming Education Summit and a lot of pledges have been made on education, there's really not been a shift in mentality on actually investing more there. So my question is, how can we harness when we see that there's restricted budgets, there's not a change in mentality to invest more in education, how can we really harness the potential that education has in order for us to grow better, to come back and rebuild better? Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have Thea Rusten Grastveit, who's a policy advisor in SLUG, Debt Justice Network Norway.
Thank you. Yeah, this is, like you said, Bård Vegar, big crisis has a tendency to sort of need to grow to a large proportion before we actually start to face them head on. And as you all probably know, the sovereign debt crisis building up is going to pose huge problems for development, of course, for education, but also for climate adaptation, yeah, health, social protection. So I'm just wondering, seeing as 54 developing or low-income and middle-income countries are now facing debt distress according to a UNDP report from October, encompassing over 50% of poor people. How do you, especially in NORAD and UNDP, how do you see sort of the way forward in tackling this sovereign debt crisis coming up? We need to sort of strengthen international debt architecture, but also future responsible lending and borrowing. And I'm also thinking about the private sector, seeing as a large proportion of the unsustainable debt levels are money owed to private investors, also with the highest interest rates. And like KLP is a very good example of a responsible investor. We are collaborating on, principles for responsible lending and borrowing. But so NORAD and UNDP, where do you see sort of the way forward and your role in tackling this crisis coming up?
Yes, from Zoom we have one question. They thank you for an enlightening conference, and they would like to know what is the main SDG to invest in. And it's also obvious that we're sort of out of the pandemic crisis in Norway because we are twice as many here physically than are actually watching on Zoom. So that's a good sign.
Thank you very much. 3 questions or comments, and I think we're gonna start. Maybe we'll start with you, Heidi, if you want to start.
Yes, I can start by answering the last one. Which SDG to invest most in? Well, as we all know, they're interlinked. But one SDG, there's a lot of investment opportunities. That's the clean energy one. And that, of course, goes hand in hand with the development in so many of the developing countries as well. We all know the huge investment needs, and there's a lot happening there, again, about creating partnerships and then rolling out new projects. And also, yes, now we have a war in Europe, and we have a geopolitical situation or geopolitical crisis and security crisis. And the only positive thing that might come out of that is an increased tempo in building more renewable energy, not only in Europe but also across the world. So there's a lot more focus on energy and increased tempo in building renewable energy.
Well, it's a hard one. But
Just in response to all of these.
yeah, and I think that maybe the questions about education and debt is more to Nora than UNDP. But I would like to use the opportunity to say that something that I also said to the Norwegian government, that some of the SDGs have to be combined with the other ones, as we've been talking about in the beginning. And my hope is that we looked more about consequences on inequality when we are working towards other SDG goals as well. So I would say that if we more often could see, okay, when we are going to invest in renewable energy, when we are going to work on women's rights, how should we do it in a way that also reduces inequality? So more focusing on that SDG, I think that would be good also for solving other ones.
Yeah, first to pick up the question on education, I mean, I'm a big fan of numbers, and not because of the numbers themselves, because they tell stories about real people. And maybe the worst numbers I've seen about COVID and the COVID is the numbers on the learning gap that has emerged from COVID. I think maybe in 3 decades or so we'll look back and see what was the worst thing with COVID, is that so many kids globally were out of school not for 2 weeks, but I mean for months and years, and some never came back, and others, there was a learning gap which will follow them into adulthood and influence societies negatively. So I'm extremely worried about the negative development consequences. Of course, spending ODA on it is part of the solution, but the main solution is again back to national governments and their priorities, and that's my segue over to that, because, like you said, and I also mentioned before, especially the least developed countries are facing, on average, a big increase in their debt burden, and that basically means that their ability to finance these basic human capital in investments, like we're talking about here, is very weak. So first I should say that debt as an issue that's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is dealing with, not Nora. So, but just as an analysis. But we are dealing with or managing grants. And at least we are working with that in 2 ways, I think you can say. First, of course, but by financing human capital, gender equality, human rights, education, healthcare, all these things, extremely important and well-spent development assistance. But the second thing is, of course, working with institution building and learning, and how we can partner with countries, for instance, to make their tax systems better and more efficient. The Norwegian Development Program Tax for Development is one such program where, at its best, it has been extremely important to collect more taxes, not by increasing the level of taxes, by simply collecting the taxes a country has decided that it should have, to actually be able to do it more efficiently. In Tanzania, we've looked at it, and we believe that we have, for every Norwegian kroner spent, Tanzania has collected 100 times as much in taxes through their system, just by making it more efficient. And also working with institutions where it's possible to make those more efficient, to create transparency and so on, is extremely important. And that's also an important part of that is civil society, because we see that if institutions work better if there's free media to criticize, if there are civil society organizations to point out things, to criticize and so on. So that's also actually an important part of better governance.
Debt management for development can be your next program.
Yeah, it's not the first idea of a new poor development program I've heard. So no, I'm just I will ask answer very diplomatically. That's a political question.
Yeah. So on the question of debt, it's very complex. We all know, right? And we're only talking about public debts. We're not yet talking about private sector debts, which is even a bigger challenge, right? So on both sides, there's a short-term solution and a longer-term solution issue, right? So for the short-term solution of public debts, there are initiatives that IMF, for example, right, and some other players are putting forward, but then the impact has been very limited. Right? On the longer-term issue, it does come to a question of the financial architecture. Right? So the G20 is discussing this, right? And the UNDP is the secretariat of a G20 working group on sustainable financing. Right? So we're supporting a discussion in this regard, but it's very, very difficult. It's political, right? And the consequences, related to the question of education is obvious, right? Because we always say that developing countries are not spending enough. They're only spending 3% or 4% of the GDP on education or health. I guess it's not what they want to do, right? But they just don't have the ability. So that is comes back to what Bart Vega said earlier. In principle, you need to finance what is needed. But that's the difficulty, right? That's the difficulty part of it, right? Internationally, you don't have really an effective system to do that efficiently. Right? So I guess that's really the discussion we needed to really have, more and more, right? So this is so I don't really answer, I cannot answer your question, but we are having a lot of discussion, debate on this, okay? And on the question of SDG, which SDGs, obviously it's interconnected, right? Even energy is interconnected, right? Because energy, is so important for solutions to other issues, poverty, productive use of energy, education, right? And health. Right? So once you have energy, you can have better health service, right? And so forth, right? So it's really difficult to say which one to pick, And but if I have to pick one, right? So I would, put in SDG 16, the governance, right? And thanks to Norway's support, right, in a way, and our Oslo Governance Center over the many years have been working with other UN partners, right, to have developed a system to collect statistics that would allow countries to, collect the data that can provide comparable data across, several SDG 16 indicators, right? Because we do believe, as we all agree, right, the governance, quality of governance is so important, right? So I think, although it is very political, but if you focus on the principles of effectiveness, accountability, and inclusiveness, right? And we're talking about democracy at work, right? So I think this is really important that we invest in. Now, and again, I'll come back to the question of cooperation and so forth, right? The world is divided, very divided. Very unfortunately, it is reducing the opportunities of collaboration, right? But this comes to what, again, Bart Vega said earlier, right? And I don't remember your quote, right, of one of your previous prime ministers, right? When the alternative is a conflict, more conflict, certainly, sitting down and talking is a much more effective way to deal with the differences. So I think in this regard, it's because this is so political, right? So I cannot get into this publicly. It's difficult, right? But I think common sense has to prevail. I think, right? Common sense has to prevail. We have to work together to find a win-win situation, right? And not lose-lose situation. And it is in our interest to work together to find this win-win situation. I think we can do it. I'm optimist in this regard, but it does require more optimists to work together. Yeah. Idealistic optimists to work together, right? So I hope this helps. Thank you.
Thank you. We have the time for some very short concluding remarks, if you want to. Positive concluding remarks. Heidi, do you want?
Yeah. I'm also very hopeful for the future. I'm worried, absolutely, but still hopeful. There's a great expectations to the finance industry and the private sector in general, and I do think that we can contribute to that and fulfill many of those expectations. But what's important for me to say that we can't do that alone. The private sector as well as the finance industry have been very vocal about that we need ambitious policies. And that's still the case, and we still haven't those policies in place. Especially when it comes to climate, I think we need to step up. We need to have more ambitious international climate policies for this the transformation to really happen. But again, international collaboration, international institutions, I mean, that's the key. Without those, we will never be able to do it. So the good news was the Kunming agreement, the nature agreement, and milestones like that gives us courage and hope for the future.
It might not sound very optimistic, but when leaving here and going back to office, talk about our reaction to the earthquake in Syria. But what we see there, that's an area definitely facing multiple crises. They've been in war for a long time. 2022, they had the worst drought for more than 70 years. Climate change is coming. They have big challenges due to increasing food crisis and due to the geopolitical situation. Some of the areas hardest affected, almost no one has access to. There's the only opportunity reaching some of the areas is from Gaziantep, which are now by itself in one of the most affected places from the earthquake, but still. In a place like that, you do have local organizations today stepping up, meeting the needs. They are seeking solutions, and they are doing things every day, and they have been there. We have been working together with the same civil society organizations for 12 years, and they are the ones who step up now and making change, saving lives. Even though they have to make mass graves because they don't have resources to bury people in a more respectful way, they actually manage to make change, and they are those who are also will work for building back better, for aiming for a better society after the war when things get better, and they are also optimistic and they are working together. So I think that's the way of looking at hope, that in every crisis there are local people mobilizing, making change, and they can make differences, even how hard the crisis hits.
So I was thinking while Heidi and Henriette was speaking, maybe I should adjust myself to saying that I'm a bit pessimistic in the short run, but optimistic in the long term. But anyway, no, but maybe by picking up what they said, I mean, I'm an optimist, but not meaning that I think things will just go well by itself. All these things that I talked about happened because someone did something, fought for it, worked for it, took a fight, and changed things. And that's actually that's why we can hope, that hope is a realistic scenario. Around the world, there's a strong civil society, local organization, people organizing, helping others, involving, fighting for their interests, challenging governments, and so on. There are lots of companies now asking, like you say, I mean, you're asking for more ambitious policies because that will drive the rest of your competitors to do more. We need more of that also on the development side, and there are lots of companies, so where there are things happening, especially they're picking up the risk of not responding to climate change and nature loss and so on. And also because within global organizations, and not only within the UN, but of course importantly within the UN system, I think we've seen before that in really challenging times, who do we actually have that has a presence? That's UN agencies. In Ukraine, the UNDP and others were actually there, were able to deliver alongside civil society. And I think we also see that now on the African continent, that we work so much with sub-Saharan Africa, that strong multilateral partners that are able to step up is among our most important partners that when we want to do something. So thanks for being here. Great to discuss with you.
Yeah, so how much time do I have? Okay, a couple of points very quickly, okay, building on what Heidi, Henrietta, and Bart Berger has said. And so one is that we have learned a lot from previous disasters, crisis, and development, right? And we need to apply those lessons in our actions, right? And then we don't need more innovation or solutions. The solutions a lot of solutions are there, right? In the case of earthquake, for example, we've experienced so many earthquakes, right? I was in Pakistan in 2005, when the major earthquake in South Asia, in northern Pakistan, took place. Right? Huge losses. Right? And also, I was regional director for Asia Pacific when in 2015, the earthquake in Nepal happened. Right? Huge losses. Now, and in China before, and of course now. One lesson is very clear that a lot of damage and loss of property and life could have been avoided if only the building codes were enforced, right, or applied. So it is a question of governance again. It's not a question of technology and so forth, right? So now, as we build back better, let's say, right, how do you ensure that the governance system work, right, that the quality of reconstruction actually can avoid the future losses or reduce future losses, right? So here, of course, there's a conflict that from developing country point of view or from the local population point of view that, okay, I don't have enough resources to do that. My priority is to have a roof, right, on top of, so I just don't have time to worry about the building code, right? So this is where I guess international cooperation can come in. Perhaps with the concept of financing the additionality, right? On top of what local resources are available, do you finance additionality to bring this up to international standards, for example, right? So we have lessons learned, we have technology, we have the legislation, right? What we need is a collaboration to make that happen, right? So it's not, rocket science, right? So, but these are the issues we needed to work together to have common sense, right? So since time is short, I just end on the note of the need for collaboration, because this is the best outcome we can have, right? And working together and to create the outcome that we want. So common sense, right? And shared, prosperity, shared benefits, right? And we have example of the European Union. European Union is about shared prosperity, right? But what happens, when we go outside the European Union? What is the adjusting mechanism, right, in the world that would allow you to achieve the kind of outcome you can achieve in European Union? These are the questions, right, that is confronting us, right? So I'm not helping, but right, so we have a lot to do. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. This has been a very insightful discussion, and I think the conclusion can be that collaboration is the key, that we can do this together. So thank you all for coming today.
Thank you. Thank you.